All right, let me see. Testing, 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 testing. Kendra! What's up, everybody? If my mic sound funny, please let me know. If my mic good. Shout out to Garfield. You did well. You dealt with the sources, which what you're supposed to do. And now, you're going to separate, well, people are going to separate themselves from who they side with right now because a lot of people are emotionally attached to somebody that they follow because they're a fan of that particular person. And at the end of the day, they're entertained by this particular person. So you did well, man. Way to represent. Um, yeah, I did see a few of the fellas in the chat that was a good look too. But I'm gonna get into this. Let me get into this, man. So there's been a lot centered around what actually happened um, to our ancestors coming off the continent, and it's a lot of speculation about that whole process, like what really happened and who did what and what actually took place. Lately, I actually been building up to what people have a lot of questions about, and today I'm gonna try to answer some of those questions um, in this particular presentation, and then gain, and then the next one deliver a big blow to a lot of the speculation and pseudo claims that are out there. Um, I do want to shout out everybody who supported my article that I dropped yesterday. So that lets you know that I actually been working um, on paper on Microsoft Word. That thing was like 5 pages. So I do understand that some people just won't take the time out to actually read the article. However, if you do have about 20 minutes or less to read the actual article, I'm sure that you'll get something away from it. And if you want to share your thoughts, that'll be dope too. I would appreciate that. So we're going to talk about 4,000 force miles. That's the name of the actual presentation. Um, and I'm gonna get in it in just a second. I have to send a link to somebody real quick. But yeah, thanks, Edmund. I appreciate you tuning in and everybody that's tuned in right now. I know y'all could be doing other things on somebody's YouTube channel or live stream, dealing with whatever they got going on. I don't know. I kind of detached myself from that. So um, I just appreciate the ear that people lend. So we're gonna go ahead and get into it, and hopefully, we all can learn something. I'm gonna let the information speak. I'm not gonna assume, speculate, or mislead anyone. The journey from West Africa to Brazil could take as much as 35 days. Africans shackled, chained, and stacked side by side. Anywhere between 2 to 600 bodies crossed Atlantic ship after ship over 4,000 oceanic miles. Unfamiliar with their destination, the unknown for those who survived the voyage could only hope to see better days. The Holocaust of African enslavement was organized crime. This international criminal enterprise was organized in Arabia and Europe. They were the perpetrators. They planned it, they financed it, trained and armed the armies, built the ships, sailed the ships, built the forts, forged the chains, seared the branding irons, supplied the guns, set the terms of engagement, organized the caravans and missions, set up the harems and concubines, captured innocent Africans in the millions, militarily enforced their kidnapping with guns and swords, justified and sanctified it with their religions. Let's go.
For he killed me, he shipped me regular. Oh, I live with a bad manola. Oh, I live with a bad manobadabu. Oh, I live with a bad manola. For I go to the riverside regular. Masa baby won't kill me. Masa baby won't kill me. Masa baby won't kill me. For he killed me, he shipped me regular.
Kidnap. To seize and detain or carry away by unlawful force or fraud, and often with a demand for ransom. It's Merriam-Webster definition. From Senegambia to Upper Guinea coast to the Gold Coast to the Bight of Benin to the Bight of Biafra to the Luango coast, the sinister white man surrounded the West African coast in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century slave blockade. This area became Africa's death knell. During this era of high renaissance in Europe, the pattern of the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade was set. First, the initial bartering of steel. In a few cases, kidnapping of slaves was work of the Portuguese captains. In the estuaries of one another of the rivers of the West African coast, these men in ships of about 100 tons would carry their slave cargoes along with gold and other goods to some import and trumpet of the Portuguese African enterprise. According to P. Curtin, the number of slaves taken from Africa by Europeans between 1451 and 1600 amounted to 274,900. Of these, Europe and Atlantic islands took about 149,000, Spanish America about 75,000, and Brazil about 50,000. These figures are characteristics of early period of the Atlantic slave trade, before the great development of the plantation system in the New World, which sparked off a heavy demand for black labor. The entire Western Hemisphere, which includes North America, Central America, South America, Alaska, and Canada, was captured by whites in their genocidal siege. The first Africans in America were brought there by the conquistadors who were their masters. They came mostly from Senegambia and either had first been brought to Europe or had been born there. They were called Ladinos in America because they knew Spanish and Portuguese and had been at least partly influenced by the civilization of the Iberian countries. They were highly thought of, contrary to Bazoles, who had been brought directly from Africa and were carriers of a very different culture. The Christianized blacks mentioned in the 16th century documents issued in Spain, La Española, and the rest of the Spanish Empire were known as Ladinos, and the term referred in general to the blacks who were familiar in general with the religion, cultures, and languages of Castile of Portugal, either because of having been born and raised in those territories or due to long contact with or exposure to these cultures. Conversely, those blacks with no familiarity with the Iberian cultures and languages, typically those brought straight from Africa, were called Bazoles. During the rise of sugar in the 16th century, shipments of cargo could be seen making its way to Brazil, Buenos Aires, and a few other small areas. Spanish Brazil at the time was getting its kidnapped victims from the Congo region. The Portuguese captains, after the cease of trade in Benin, continued to illegally trade for enslaved Africans, but more importantly, focus on their neighbors next door across the river. Captains from Portugal not only carried most of the slaves from Africa north to Cape Verde Islands to Sao Tome or to Europe, but they took most Spanish slaves across the Atlantic and often sold them in Cartagena or Veracruz. Portuguese traders were to be fond of Viceroy Peru. Most sales involved one or two slaves with a maximum of 10 to 20, yet all the same, the overall numbers rose steadily. As a testimony to the eagerness of whites to loot the Western Hemisphere and drag its wealth back to Europe, by 1494, 2 years after Columbus had first invaded the Caribbean islands, Pope Alexander VI declared in his international decree that the world outside of Europe would be divided into two zones, one on either side of the lines running north to south, 640 kilometers west of the Azores. Look that up, the Azores. In his decree, God's representatives, the Pope, gave the Portuguese all the land seized in the eastern half, and the Spanish were given the rights to the land stolen on the western region. This genocidal decree was agreed upon and later became enshrined in law with the drafting of a Treaty of Tordesillas, of 1494. Before the arrival of numerous Africans to the New World, people actually populated the Americas. Conquistadors on board a ship full of thugs who recently had nothing prior to arriving to the New World, led by drunk and raged villains looking to prosper off what they had stumbled upon that wreaked havoc on the indigenous people. For 500 years, such European savages toward non-white populations around the world are legend. Entire populations were made extinct throughout the Western Hemisphere in the wake of this white genocidal siege. Even babies were mutilated. In less than a century, between 1519 and 1580, the indigenous Native American population in Mexico alone fell from 25 million to 2 million, and by 1607 there lived a mere 1 million. Peru lost 10 million out of 11 million of its indigenous population at the hands of Spanish, swords, cannons, diseases, and being worked to death in silver mines. By the mid-16th century, the Spaniards had completely exterminated the indigenous population of Cuba and other islands in the Caribbean. The mid-16th century also saw the first time the emergence of a number of Spanish slave merchants of significance. In those days, the market was open one. There were no monopolists, and the Spanish Empire took in more slaves than the Portuguese one. Of course, the Spaniards still had as a rule to buy from the Portuguese, though sometimes they carried the slaves which they had obtained across the Atlantic in their own ships. About 30 Spanish ships were licensed for Africa in the 1550s, but they also usually went to buy in Cape Verde Islands, no farther. Those who broke the law and tried to buy in Guinea were few and far between. The Orhe family from Seville regularly had at least 5 to 6 ships that made constant trips from Seville, Cape Verde to America voyages. The Orhe family seemed the most powerful consortium in Spanish American commerce for a time, their interests embracing wax, cloths, mercury for use in the silver mines, wine, and olive oil, as well as slaves. Some of these things came from the haciendas at Cazala de la Sierra, wine, and Alamadilla, olives, in the Sierra to the north of Seville and near Granada, respectively. I'm about to do a lot of name dropping. In the 1560s, the first merchant in the city was probably Juan Antonio Corzo, who was Italian origin, though he did not derive from the old Gnaeus Sevillano oligarchy. His first accumulated fortune in Peru, selling linen, oil, saffron, and above all slaves. He returned to establish himself in Seville in 1558 when he had a network of trading posts all run by members of his family. By 1566, his fortune was worth 31 million maravedis. By 1568, Corzo had been overtaken by Pedro Lopez Martinez, whose principal activity was certainly the sale of slaves, though, like most of the other entrepreneurs mentioned. He was also interested in goods, mercury, cochineal, linen, and wine. I'm name dropping. I hope y'all keeping up with me. I'm going to slow it down. The famous doctor, the Ghana's origin, Nicholas D. Monardos, bought shares in slave ships. As usual, there were Italian merchants involved in addition to Corzo, Juan Fernando de Vilvado, Geronimo Catino of Ghana and Seville, Thomas de Maroon or Marigny and Sanlúcar, Leonardo Lamelino, and there were also Jerome and Giovanni Battista Botti of Florence, the latter a creditor. Now listen, y'all, a creditor, Hernan Cortez. These merchants were more or less law-abiding in that they paid the regulation fee per slave on shipment. But extra slaves beyond those provided by the rules were often on board the ship by the captain or the owner, and many more slaves were carried than are indicated by official figures. So basically what we are looking at are financiers, creditors, and people that were involved specifically in the sale of slaves, purchase of slaves, and so forth. Now remember, at the end of this, I specifically stated that there were more people carried off than would be covered by the financiers. In 1535, Canard wrote in Evero, "It was as if I had been carried off to a city in hell. Everywhere I only met blacks." The Indians all the same made clear that they supported the introduction of African slaves. For example, in the 1580s, a group of indigenous people in Mexico told the viceroy, Alvaro Manrique de Zúñiga, a cousin of Cortez's second wife, that they were themselves quite unable to work in sugar plantations and that difficult and arduous work was only for blacks and not for the thin and weak Indians. I'm setting the stage here. And Felipe to the African slave trade was naturally given by the trend towards the outlawing of Indian slavery in the Americas. As a result of agitation of Bartolome de las Casas and the Dominicans. An indication of the mood in 1544 is shown by a letter of Cristobal de Benavente, public prosecutor of the Supreme Court of Mexico, to the king. This is what he said: "Every day the gold mines are giving less profit because of the lack of Indian slaves. In the end, if your majesty abolishes local slavery," wrote Benavente, "there will be no alternative to allowing blacks into the land, at least in the mines." The main labor force on these mid-16th century Brazilian plantations were still admittedly indigenous Brazilians, slaves certainly, but at least not as yet Africans, or at least not yet Africans on a large scale. By 1570, disenchantment about Indian labor had set in. The Portuguese captains sought slaves outside their captivities. Excuse me. But still there were shortages of Durant Color. He wrote, listen to what he writes, y'all, to the king in 1546, that whereas in the past, when the Indians were needy, they used to come and work for practically nothing. Now they wanted beads and feather caps, colored clothing that a man could not afford to buy himself. In the good old days, as Yusuf remembered, some tribes would sell an Indian slave for a chisel. But that was no longer the case in 1570. Little by little, in the new cities of the new empire, African slaves began to work much as they had done for hundreds of years in Portugal as servants, gardeners, cooks, seamen, and as a symbol of wealth, and finally on plantations, with some of the attitudes of the Portuguese at home being emulated by colonists in dealing with the Africans. Already in 1576, Fray Garcia Simons, or they call him SJ, had written, Hereon finds all the slaves which one might want, and they cost practically nothing, with the exception of the leaders. Almost all the natives here either are born in slavery or reduced to the conditions without the least pretext. After his victories, the king gives entire villages over to the subalterns, with the right either to kill or to sell inhabitants. English expansion in Africa in the 16th century was similar to that of the French. They began by establishing solid economic relations with Morocco after the departure of the Portuguese in 1541. Between 1550 and 1565, English trading companies sent several expeditions, reports of which have survived. They explored the coast of West Africa as far as the Gulf of Benin, where they bought gold hides and a few slaves. Portuguese accounts show that by the end of the 16th century, the English were in contact with the population of the Gold Coast, but were little interested in the slave trade. It is said by the end of the century, Europe had ousted the French and Portuguese. In 1588, the first English company for trade in Guinea was established mainly by merchants from London and Exeter. There is no evidence that this company developed to any great extent. Possibly at the end of the 16th century, the English found looting Castilian ships on the waters of the Atlantic was more profitable than trading with Africa. Between 1593 and 1607, some 200 ships set out to Africa from Holland. In 1594 and 1595, the Dutch came to Gorée Island in West Africa, Senegal, Dakar, okay? And a few years later, they reached Benin, where they bought cotton goods and cowrie shells, which they traded for gold and silver on the Gold Coast. In 1611, they built Fort Nassau, what they call him Mori, on the Gold Coast, the first fortified trading post on West African coast. They also developed trade with the Accra region. By 1617, the Dutch were so strong in Senegambia that they were a dominant force on the island of Gorée, and had supplanted not only the Portuguese but also the English and French in Joe, Porto, and Rafisque. They retained this strong position for over 50 years. At the same time, the ships visited the coast of Congo and Angola. The Dutch, like the English and French, were initially little interested in slave trade, but things changed at the beginning of the 16th century when the Dutch began to purchase slaves in Elmina, Accra, Arda, and Benin, and also Calabar, Gabon, and Cameroon. The slaves were sold in exchange for sugar to planters on the island of St. Thomas or transported to Brazil. The conquest of Angola in 1641 was closely associated with the labor needs of the Dutch in Brazil. Remember that. The Dutch owned land in the northeastern part of Brazil, which they would later lose to some other people in a battle. In the two previous presentations, I introduced you to, when I mean previous, I mean a while ago, to two shipping companies that controlled the shipping industry led by the Dutch. It was the Dutch East Indian Companies and the Dutch West Indian Companies. Both companies literally dominated the transportation of kidnap victims and are responsible for moving our ancestors from one place to another in bondage against their will. These are legitimate shipping companies that had a monopoly in their era on the kidnapping. P.D. Curtin estimates that between 1541 and 1600, 274,900 blacks were carried to Europe and America. For the next few years, the number rose to 1.3 million, or 1,341,100, to reach 6 million in the 18th century, almost 2 million of them being exported to Brazil. Excuse me. In 1570, the Brazilian black population was only 2,000 or 3,000. Most slaves were still Indians, but these indigenous captains were becoming less easy to acquire because of the disease brought by the Portuguese. The epidemic of dysentery, combined with influenza of the 1560s, was destructive in Brazil as smallpox had been in the 1520s in Mexico and the Caribbean. It is true that Indians still accounted for 2/3 of the Pernambuco labor force of sugar plantations in the 1580s, but these Indians were poor workers, for they were quite unused to such continuous and back-breaking toil. Alright, Africa, which had initially been seen by Europeans as a rich source of gold, now became a reservoir of labor for many European estates in America, particularly the rapidly developing sugarcane plantation. The import of black labor to northeastern Brazil, which had been very heavy at the time of Portuguese rule, increased yet further with the Dutch occupation. From 150 Negroes outnumber Europeans in the Americas as a whole. In total, less than 300 years, these whites ruthlessly depopulated and seized 4 continents. Whites also captured Africa while clawing like buzzards around Arabs over stolen North African land. In post-Columbian invasions, the whites seized 25,400,000 square miles of land, some 41% of the land surface of the planet Earth. In so doing, these whites increased their territory from Europe's 4,100,000 square miles to a total of 36 million square miles, from 6% to over 63% of the surface land on Earth. Do the math. 63% of the land they own. In the English colonies in the Caribbean, slave imports rose from 263,700 in the 17th century to 1.4 million in the 18th century. The situation was similar to in the islands occupied by France, with San Domingo importing almost 790,000 slaves in the 18th century. The cultivation of sugarcane was also started in Cuba, creating a similar need for labor. Dutch Suriname, the English and the French plantations in Central America and the northern part of South America also absorbed great numbers of black slaves. The single largest American importer of African slaves was Brazil. During the course of the slave trade, Brazil received approximately 38% of all African imported into the New World. However, in order to fully appreciate the experience of the African in the New World, we would have to look at the relative participation of the various regions in the slave trade century by century. This procedure is necessary because of differences in the date of venture into the transatlantic trade and the fluctuations in volume of imports by each region influence not only the population spread, but also the attitudes of the societies which emerged in the Americas by the late 19th century. The 17th century saw the beginning of a well-organized Atlantic slave trade. In the course of the century, the annual average rate of importation of slaves rose tremendously. This period also witnessed a considerable decline in the participation of the Spanish colonists in the slave trade. Now, the peak of the African diaspora in the New World was reached in the 18th century. Both the plantation societies in the Americas and the slave trade reached their fullest maturity. This phenomenal growth in the slave trade could have attested to by the fact that more than half of all the Africans imported into the New World arrived during the 18th century. This will actually conclude the brief bill. In my next presentation, I will deal with the 17th and 18th centuries leading into the 19th century. There I will expose a lot more information dealing with what people really want to know right now. What's the name of the ships? Where are the ships? What evidence do we have to show? Will there be newspaper clippings? Will there be articles? Will there be direct quotes from chroniclers? There will be. Will the primaries speak for themselves? Just like this presentation, I will let the chroniclers, the people who are eyewitness accounts, speak. We will not go through and embellish the information. We will let the information speak for itself. For those who want to deny what happened, or those who want to say it didn't happen on a grand scale, and for those who just want to turn their back on Africa, it will be addressed in my next presentation. So what I basically did was sum up the late 1400s, the 15th, and the 1600s, leading into the 1700s, if you weren't paying attention. I intentionally did that for a reason, because I feel like we actually are addressing this argument incorrectly. Maybe if we take baby steps and walk our way from a particular period, then we can get somewhere. That's why I started what I did in the 1400s in the last presentation dealing with the kidnapping. And then I got into the 1500s and the 1600s in this one. So we're going to deal with the 17 to 1800s and some of the 1900s. I don't like to talk for hours, so I had to cut myself off from putting my slides together because I didn't want to put too much on people.
Check this out, family. Just did this video so people will know who we are, man. I got an exciting team that's out we're pushing solutions in the community. You know, it's something that I always wanted to put together. We got my man Nahisi, you know, bringing that science net and there with the linguistics, fortune favorite with the music and the solutions in the community. Saint Kofa from House of Consciousness, bringing that realness to balance us out. And he's also coming out with that Mossy Warrior Clan workout program. Him and Heru Sarah Moon, look out for that. Other than that, man, we got Class of Shabazz, expert in Moorish history. Amin Ma'at Ra already got 3 books out destroying the Christianity thing from a Roman perspective, telling that story. Of course, we got the God Killer rolling with me as always. Shout out to Pit Boss, who did our logo and this video. Before this video, you know, the intro that y'all saw. So if y'all want, you know, something like that, holla at Pit Boss, Digital Pit Boss Entertainment. Holla at me and I'll get you that contact. We also got to give it up to Tyre RBG, my comrade that did the music for the video. So I believe it's TyreRBG.com. Hit him up. And, you know, the brother's talented. You can get his album, Hymns of the Whirlwind, Pan-African music all day. So, you know, we just want to do this video to name the members of Mossy Warrior Clan and let y'all know that, you know, expect high scholarship, expect high science, expect culture, expect solutions, and expect practical applications that you can put into your life and solve some problems. And we're going to be keeping it African, man. You know how we do. So that's all I got, man. Short little video. Black Panther, Mossy Warrior Clan, Spears is flying, Pseudos is crying. I'm out.
And for those who still watching, if you want to critique my work, feel free. I would appreciate it. Here go my sources. Here go some of my sources. And like that,